Welcome or welcome back to Never Again Is Now, a podcast about anti-Semitism. In this episode, we look into an important chapter of Holocaust history, what is now called Holocaust by bullets. From 1941 to 1944, the Nazis murdered millions of Jews in mass shootings in Eastern Europe and did so with inconceivable cruelty. Yet, when we commemorate and draw lessons from the history of the Holocaust, this chapter often gets too little attention. Today, we speak with a relative of victims of the Holocaust by bullets. He has made a documentary about it that we recommend you watch after listening to this episode. John Pollock is an attorney in Chicago, Illinois. In 2019, he went to Ukraine to film interviews and mass killing sites from the Holocaust that took place there. His 33-minute documentary titled Beyond Babi Yar is available on Vimeo, and you can find a direct link to the documentary on the description of today's podcast episode. John, we're curious to learn from you about the history of the Holocaust by bullets in Eastern Europe and your documentary. Welcome.
Thank you.
And before I ask the first question, I want to say that you just heard Evelyn Marcus speak, and I'm Phyllis Zimbler-Miller. And now I'm going to ask the question. I get to do the first one, which is tell us an outline of what your documentary is about and what the main message is.
The documentary is about the mass shootings that occurred in Eastern Europe, specifically in Ukraine, as part of the Holocaust during the war. And it is about also the state of remembrance of these victims. There were over 2 million who were shot, 2 million Jews who were shot in Eastern Europe. And protecting and memorializing the killing sites or execution sites so that these people are properly buried as they should be.
And why did you make this documentary? What was your motivation?
Like many things, it starts with my family. My background. I was born in Detroit, Michigan, 1952, after the war. My father had grown up in Detroit during the Depression, during the years of Henry Ford and Father Coughlin. And
wait, can we just interrupt for those people who don't
Sure.
know? John's talking about people who at that time were particularly known for their anti-Semitism.
Correct. I would say they're the two largest and most notorious anti-Semites in American history.
Yes.
And they were in full force when my father was growing up. So he had to contend with a lot of anti-Semitism. He wasn't religious himself, but, he'd go walking through a Catholic neighborhood and he'd fight. And he, a poor family, so he was a street kid. He graduated from high school in 42. He joined the Army not long thereafter, when he was 18. Was sent to Europe in October of 43 to prepare for the invasion. He was in an infantry division, the 28th Infantry Division. They landed not on D-Day, but they landed in July, latter part of July. And my father immediately went into combat. I've studied this a lot. I was, very close to my father. I, like a lot of sons or children, perhaps, I idolized him. He landed, he was 19, he was a sergeant, he was an assistant squad leader. On VE Day, May of 45, I once got a list of soldiers in his company, and we went over it. And he said there were only a handful of original soldiers, who landed on Omaha Beach in July, who were there on VE Day. 28th Division went through, the deadliest battles in American history. My father was there, initially assistant squad leader when he was 19. He became a squad leader when he was 20. The Battle of Normandy, Hurtgen Forest. I don't know if that's well known in the U.S., but it's one of the deadliest battles in American history. My father, as a rifleman, squad leader, was at the very front line. After that, people thought the war would end soon, and my father's division was sent up to the Ardennes. Turns out that's where the Battle of the Bulge happened. So my father's division was overrun in the very first days of the Battle of the Bulge. My father somehow managed to survive that initial assault. And by the end of the war, he was what they call a platoon sergeant, an acting platoon sergeant. He was 20 years old. They had a system in Europe where if you were a combat soldier, you got a certain number of points. And if you had enough points, if you were over there long enough, been in enough, you were exempt from being transferred to the Pacific after VE Day. And my father had enough points. He was 20, but they wanted him to stay in the Army. They offered him a field commission as an officer, and he turned it down. And he came back to Detroit. He had always dreamed of going to the University of Michigan, but it was way beyond his means. Well, the GI Bill took care of that. So he enrolled in the University of Michigan in October of 45 with the first wave of returning veterans. Went through college and law school there in under 5 years, and became one of the leading trial lawyers in Detroit. So I'm very proud of my dad, but this is an important background because my father was, let's say, he wasn't religious at all. He was not observant, but he was a stand-up American. He was a stand-up Jew. And this is my legacy on my father's side. Now, my mother's side, there was no connection to the Holocaust on my father's side. As a matter of fact, they, like many American Jews, completely cut themselves off from their Eastern European heritage. My father, who I always thought knew everything, didn't know where his father was born. His father, I later learned, was born in Slutsk, Belarus. So there's no connection to the Holocaust on my father's side. On my mother's side, on the other hand, my mother's parents were immigrants from Eastern Europe. It's now Ukraine. They came from a shtetl, and their story is they came over at different times. They were married, they had a kid, but my grandfather came over first, which is very common, to try and find a way to make a living. He had no formal education, of course, and had no money or didn't speak English. But what happened is shortly after he got here, World War I broke out. And World War I in Eastern Europe and that area of Ukraine, there were pogroms. I mean, it wasn't just a war. So my grandmother and her child, my uncle, were lost, and they survived these pogroms. They came to America, and my grandfather had, typical story, acquired a junkyard in a small town in Michigan.
My mother's family, they had the junkyards in southern Indiana.
Yeah, this was very common. You could have your own schedule. You didn't have to work on Saturdays if you didn't want to. And so my mother grew up in this small town, the only Jewish family there. And although it was during, the 20s and 30s and 40s, they were very well respected and accepted in the community. And so that's the background. Now, my mother's had 3 older brothers. The 2 American-born brothers during the war went into the Army. They were combat infantrymen in Italy. And my grandmother, actually both of my grandparents, left their families behind when they came here. So they would correspond. They would send pictures. My grandmother was very close to her family. She had younger brothers who she raised. So she started off kind of as a junior mother, and she came to America, became a great mother, and she became a wonderful grandmother. She, according to my mother, would talk occasionally about my grandmother. I talked, um, uh, or I'd ask my mother questions. And before the war, my mother said, because my grandmother, she taught herself how to write. Okay.
John, this
Yeah.
is so fascinating, but our audience wants to know more
Oh,
about your
okay. Well,
documentary.
here it comes. Here it
Okay.
comes. So she was very close to her family. My mother said she talked about them all the time. And when the war broke out, she didn't hear from them. They were, over there. And it was at that time, the Soviet Union had taken over. And then the Germans invaded. And my grandmother didn't hear anything. So she waited several years. At the end of the war, a niece who survived sent her a letter saying everyone had been killed. And my mother said my grandmother cried the entire day. She never talked about it again. So, I grew up in this family where no one talked about these killings. And it was her mother, it was four of her younger brothers, it was a sister, it was nieces and nephews. And I love my grandmother, but I could see the pain, and I was her daughter's child. This is the matrilineal. So I was very close to her. And my mother was her only daughter and the youngest one. So growing up, my grandmother was a very big figure in my life. And although we didn't have philosophical conversations, she, I could see her pain and her love, and somehow, this is what's motivating me, together with, my father's, stand up and fight.
Yeah, that's a great explanation, I think, of what motivated you to make this remarkable documentary and
Well, thank
travel
you.
all to the Ukraine. John, what happened during the Holocaust by bullets? Could you explain that to us? Briefly, what was happening there?
Well, the Holocaust began with mass shootings in Eastern Europe, again, primarily in Ukraine.
John,
And
can we give our audience just a little bit of background? I always like to do this because it took me years to understand. And especially since tomorrow is September 1st, the Germans invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939. They had done an agreement a few days before with the Russians and divided up Poland. So for almost a year and 9 months, Ukraine and the eastern part of Poland were now under Soviet Union. It's a whole different story, but they were safe from the Germans. And then on June 22nd, 1941, the Nazis broke their agreement with the Russians. And that's when the story of the Holocaust by bullets begins. Take it away.
that's absolutely correct. When Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, the first thing he did, or one of the first things he did, is round up all the Jews. And there were a whole lot of Jews there. I mean, millions. Some were shot sooner, some were shot later. And again, I didn't learn this stuff until recently because I could never find anything out about what happened. Nobody talked about it. Nobody seemed to have any information. So in my grandmother's hometown, there was a ghetto. This was very common. They put the Jews in the ghetto and, put them to work. They'd have various actions. Some might die here or there or be worked to death. And then ultimately, with these ghettos, the term they used was liquidation. They would just take everyone out to some remote place generally and shoot them into, generally mass graves, but it could be a ravine, it could be a lake. There are all sorts of ways they did this, but it's called the
How many
Holocaust by
how
bullets
many
because,
people how many people did they shoot at a time?
Well, it would depend on the town. I mean, that's a good question. In the documentary, one of the experts who's from Father Dubois' organization, who's a key figure in this, said it could be one. He called it a mass grave of one, or it could be 10,000. It depended on the area. In my grandmother's hometown, it was about 500 Jews who were shot there. In my grandfather's hometown, he wasn't as close to his family as my grandma, 4,000. Okay. And I also went there when I was in Ukraine, and they have a memorial. It's about 3 feet high. There are 4,000 dead. And in Ukrainian, it just says, the German fascists killed 4,000 Jews, and that's it. I think something better than that could be done. But yeah, 4,500, the largest, according to Father Dubois, who searched for these places, was, I think, 52 or 54,000 near Odessa. And what happened? Yeah.
I just wanted to say, because our audience may know, and your title is Beyond Babi Yar, that Babi Yar was done over 2 days, and it was over 30,000, as I recall.
That's right. That's absolutely right.
30,000 people shot in 2 days.
Jewish men, women, and children. And so a lot of our audience may have heard of that, even though they may not even connect it with the Holocaust by bullets.
Well, that's true. It was, Babi Yar was very large. It was relatively early in the mass shootings. And look, this was my family, okay? It's taken me a long time to get over the horrors, which I think everyone needs to do, because if you don't get past the horrors, you can't see the injustice that exists here. And the horrors are, and I'll just briefly talk about them, and I don't want people to, freak out. But these mass shootings, number one, there was misdirection. They would tell these, you're going to Palestine or something like that, which is consistent with the lies of the Nazis. They were forced to undress. They were shot into a pit, or they were in a pit and shot. And once the shooting was over, they just pushed dirt into the mass graves, which had often been dug by the Jews themselves. And probably about half were still alive. So about half were buried alive. And Father Dubois, who found these sites, said witnesses say all the time, the grave moved for 3 days. Okay. So these are the horrors. And I don't want people to stop the film now, but these are the terrible things they went through. And then after being shot into the pits, the Germans came by when they were retreating, and they tried to burn some of these victims. And then the Soviet Union, which lost so many people. I mean, I've read 20 million civilians, maybe 2 million Jews were shot in the Soviet Union. Some were shot elsewhere. To the Soviet Union, the Jews aren't a special category. They're just peaceful Soviet citizens. They're only 10% of the victims. So there was no special category for Jewish victims who were killed as part of the Holocaust in the Soviet Union. Therefore, even Jews in the Soviet Union weren't aware of that it was a Holocaust or a genocide.
And John, what was the role of the Ukrainians in this Holocaust by bullets, this mass shooting of Jews?
It's an interesting topic because like everywhere else, there were Ukrainians who helped, who helped the Germans, and there were Ukrainians who helped Jews. In the film, there's this wonderful woman named Alti Rodal who speaks, and she says she's alive. She was born after the war because Ukrainians saved her parents. But she said she never met her grandparents because other Ukrainians killed her parents' parents. So you don't, it's one of these things you don't know. But in terms of politics, you know, there were these Ukrainian nationalists who aligned themselves with the Nazis and willingly took part. The story in my grandmother's hometown was the shooting was done by a Ukrainian. And there are all sorts of benefits for these Ukrainians who helped. You know, they get on the good side of the Germans and the Nazis. There was property. There was, you know, they did well by the Nazis. So it's a mixed bag. It's a mixed bag. But I have to tell you, I try not to focus on these perpetrators, you know, the Ukrainians who helped, and because a lot of Ukrainians helped. The Germans couldn't shoot 2 million people, okay, by themselves. They didn't allocate enough soldiers for that. So it couldn't have been done without the assistance of Ukrainians. But you know, one of the points of the film is, you know, these perpetrators or these people who assisted the Germans, and, you know, they're long gone. You know, I don't see any point dwelling on that further. What we need to dwell on now is remembering the victims, protecting the sites because they're plundered, and putting up memorials. Why are they plundered? Because Ukraine is a very poor country, as you know, and now it's being destroyed. But especially in the smaller towns, they're very poor. And the word is that these mass graves are like gold mines. Okay, if you dig through, you can get some teeth, you know. And there are mass graves, mass Holocaust graves all over Ukraine that have been plundered. They've been, you know, desecrated, and bones are on the outside. Again, you don't want to dwell on the horrors, but these are the indignities: shot for being a Jew, you know, forgotten, yeah,
Yeah, what
desecrated.
what in general is the current situation of the mass graves of Jews in Ukraine?
Very bad, very bad.
Can you describe that a little bit to us?
I can, you know, first of all, if you talk about numbers, numbers are very unclear. For example, in the film, I it states that approximately 1.5 million Jews were shot in Ukraine, just in Ukraine. Well, you know, I've looked into scholarship on this. That's the low figure these days, 1.5 million. There are scholars who say that the number in Ukraine is 2.1 million. That's 600,000 higher, or it's 40% higher. And this is an indication of the neglect of these people, is they don't even have a good idea how many were shot. Now, in other countries in Eastern Europe, you know, Belarus, you know, the Baltic states, you know, there were many Jews, and there are many mass graves there which are unprotected and unmarked. But the general state is very bad. Most of them, if not the vast majority, are unprotected, meaning they can be vandalized and plundered. Most of them have no markers whatsoever. I mean, we're talking about thousands of mass graves across Eastern Europe, 2,000 at least in Ukraine. And, you know, there are no markers at them. And these people, as a result, are forgotten, not only in Ukraine and Eastern Europe, they're forgotten here in the United States. And because of that, the Holocaust remembrance field in the United States just doesn't give them the attention they deserve.
What would you like to be done with the mass graves?
Well, I'd like them to be protected, which means doing something so they cannot be vandalized and plundered, and then put up a memorial that just, you know, it doesn't have to be fancy. The memorial in my grandmother's hometown is, but it's dignified. In the film, you can see some of these memorials. One is very much like the one in my grandmother's hometown, and the process of protecting and memorializing these sites in Ukraine includes educating the local population because they don't know, oh yeah, maybe there's a massacre. Is it Jews? Is it other peaceful Soviet citizens? They may not know, they don't care, nobody talks about it. So when they go into, this project Protecting Memory, I could go into that, but they sponsored by or funded by the German Foreign Ministry, they've protected and memorialized, I think it's 14 Jewish execution sites in Ukraine, and they do a great job. That started out as a pilot project to see what could be done. I think it was a great success, and it should be a model for future protection and memorialization of mass graves in Ukraine. So it can be done. It's not an easy process. You got to educate the local population. And if you do it properly, the local population becomes, they take ownership of the memorial. When I was in Ukraine in 2015 with my daughter, there was a dedication of a Protecting Memory memorial in my grandmother's hometown. I went over there. This is how I got educated about all this. When I went back in 2019 to make the film, one of the Ukrainian educators who knew me from 2015, we're sitting on a bus. She handed me a picture of children from the town where my grandmother was from. And they were at the memorial. They were cleaning it up. They were planting flowers. And there was a picture of children holding letters in Ukrainian, okay, which I figured out, spelled out, never again. So they're educating the kids. This is the key. Ukrainians have to be educated also. So this was very moving to me to see this picture.
And there are local commemorations at some of these places, right? And with the kind of response that you would hope for.
Well, I can tell you how locals, acted or responded to the dedications of the memorials that I was personally present at. So in 2015, when I was there as a relative, of victims at my grandmother's home, a variety of people. Everyone. There were school children. Some of them spoke. They wrote essays about it. There were Ukrainian Orthodox priests. There were members of Jewish organizations. There were very old people. Men with canes. Old women with their headscarves. Local administrators, and it's just very moving to see them all respect and remember these victims who have been ignored for so long. So it's very moving. There are many speeches there, and the speeches are, I'm hearing translations through earphones, and boy, it's I couldn't ask for it. So it's all very moving. But there are many excuses I've heard for not doing anything about the shooting victims and the mass graves. And one among many is, oh, Ukrainians are such anti-Semites. If you put up a memorial, they'll vandalize. That wasn't my experience. And if you watch the film, there's a young Ukrainian woman who is a forensic archaeologist. She tries to find these sites using ground penetrating radar, and she just talked very movingly about how important it is that these people be remembered and respected. She's Ukrainian. She was born in Kyiv, So these attitudes are changing, and people must be aware of that. Ukrainians are willing to support the protection and memorialization of these sites, notwithstanding this terrible past. Now, Does this mean every single site in Ukraine is going to be supported by local people? Not necessarily, but it's very encouraging. And this needs to be known by the Jewish public in particular, but by everyone. Things are different in Ukraine now. You can protect these sites, memorialize this, and you can have support from local Ukrainians.
And besides the commemoration of the Holocaust that many Ukrainians seem to be willing to do and wanting to do, do you know anything about, in general, anti-Semitism today in Ukraine? Is it very alive? Is it not? Is it very widespread or not? Do you know anything about that?
Well, I know something. Okay, I'm not an expert, but I was there, and certainly the people I met, and I met many Ukrainians, couldn't have been nicer. But I saw a survey not long ago that said, and this was a happy surprise to me, Ukraine is the least anti-Semitic of European countries, if you can believe that. But that's what the survey said. And of course, now they have a Jewish president who's not only a Ukrainian hero, he's a worldwide hero. And the war itself has just brought everyone in Ukraine closer together, all ethnic groups. You know, there are many ethnic groups in Ukraine. I was reading something recently about a Muslim Ukrainian soldier was sharing a foxhole with a Jewish Ukrainian soldier. And he said something like, you know, whoever thought this would happen, you know, whoever thought we would get, I think the term he used was, if I can say that, so pissed off, you know, that they would actually unite. Yeah, there's real brotherhood. When Bobby Yar got hit, or Bombing Yar got hit with some shrapnel in the early days of the war, I got an email from this young Ukrainian archaeologist who said everyone in Kiev was appalled. You know, they all stood by the Jewish people and the memory. So this has, you know, anti-Semitism in Ukraine. You know, it's. I mean, sure, it still exists. It exists everywhere, but I think there's a lot of hope, which is why I think the film is especially important now, because look, you can't do much in Ukraine, obviously, but it's important now because, you know, Ukraine is in the news, and if Ukraine is to join the West, which we all hope, okay, they got to do something about the mass graves, just like Germany, you know, to be accepted into the West. But the main work and the main financing must come from Germany, okay? So Germany needs to step up, and Ukraine needs to make this a higher priority than it's been, because it has not been a priority. But the funding has to come from Germany.
Are people working on that? Are there people
well,
working on it?
This is why I made the film. You know,
Okay.
people need to get working on it. You know,
Very good.
I want everyone to see that. You know, one of the issues is subtitles, what language. Germans should see this. One of the interviewees in the film is Uwe Neumarker. Uwe is the director of the Memorial to the Murdered Jews of Europe in Berlin. I mean, he's a high-level guy. And he was very kind, he was very cooperative. He says very moving things in the film. And one of them is, you know, these memorials are expressions of responsibility of Germany. And then he says, and also of Ukraine, because you need the cooperation of Ukrainians. So if he feels that way, and I don't doubt his sincerity at all, when he sees the film, you know, he's going to have to step it up. I talked to him about it. I said, you know, there are 14 sites that have been memorialized over 9 years. What about the, you know, 3,000 other sites? What's your plan? And of course, he felt uncomfortable. But these questions need to be asked. And he said, well, we need to create a giant fund with the Ukrainians, Germans, and Ukrainians funded by Germany. And that's how you deal with this. You have to institutionalize it. Germany has something called the German War Graves Commission. I don't know if you've ever heard of it, but they've been doing this for, I don't know, 100 years, just kind of finding the dead, of course, dead German soldiers, and burying them properly and memorializing it. And that's the type of institutionalization you need, because there are all sorts of relatives of shooting victims. They can't all go over to
No.
Ukraine and do it. It's absolutely impossible. And yet I still hear people say, oh, the family members should just go to Ukraine and build a memorial.
That's not, you want the German government or as a country to take care of it.
Exactly. But to do that, Evelyn, they aren't going to just do it on their own. They have to be pressed. I'm a student of American history, I mean, generally. And there's a famous quote by Frederick Douglass, if was one of my, is you got to demand this stuff. You can't just say, oh, would you please, there are 3,000 more mass graves over there. Would you mind, please? You have to say, you did it. And in the speeches that are given at these dedications, including from Uwe Neumarker himself, it's always, we acknowledge German responsibility. We're going to take care of it. Well, 14 sites in 11 years, that's not taking care of it, Yep. So it's a long process. And let me tell you one other thing about memorializing these sites. And Uwe mentions this in the film. He says, protecting and memorializing the sites is, first of all, it's honoring these victims, which should have been done a long time ago, but it's never too late. And it's an expression of responsibility of Ukraine and Germany, especially Germany. And then he says also it's to encourage Jewish people to tell their story. Okay. I have gotten into this whole thing because I went to the dedication of the memorial in my grandmother's hometown in 2015. Before that, I thought, like everyone else, grandmother had a tough life. She went through pogroms. Her family was killed. Nobody knows where or when or how. And it's just, you kind of accept it because there's no one out there saying, look into your family history, find out who was over there, find out these names, get them into the Yad Vashem database. Nobody's saying that. So these victims have been so marginalized that, and I've thought about this a lot, that relatives of these victims internalize the marginalization. And they themselves figure, well, it's not my Holocaust. It's just, they didn't die in camps. They were shot. So what are they? It's some kind of neither here nor there. And I've experienced this kind of confusion many times in my life. I was at my daughter's bat mitzvah, and I just told about her background, including what happened to my grandmother's family. She's named after my grandmother. And afterwards, the rabbi handed my daughter, my lovely daughter, what they call the Holocaust Torah. Okay. And this is a Torah that was somehow saved from a synagogue in Czechoslovakia, I think.
Yes,
and it was just that, and I was thinking, is this the Holocaust? I mean, did my grandmother's, was it really the Holocaust? It's just such a strange thing, but I think it's a widespread phenomenon because I've read about it in others. So when you feel disconnected, you aren't motivated. It's like, we just sit here and we feel sad. Nothing can be done. Nothing can be done. Ukrainians are anti-Semites. Oh, go over there and do it yourself. So you figure, this is just the way it is. And once I was over there, I learned, this is the big, it doesn't have to be this way. So I was inspired by the 2015 dedication, and I learned it completely changed my view of the shooting victims in Eastern Europe. And I realized at that point, this is a tremendous injustice. I mean, I think in the history of the Jewish people, it's the greatest injustice, if you can believe it, after everything that's been thrown at us, because they're murdered, and half of them are buried alive, and the graves are plundered, or the Germans come, and then the Soviet Union doesn't even consider them Holocaust victims, and then once the Soviet Union collapsed and access to these sites were possible, nothing was done. Nothing was done until a French Catholic priest in 2004 began looking for these sites. This is a French Catholic priest. This isn't, Jewish organizations. So at that point, I learned, this isn't right. I mean, this has to be, publicized. So that's why I made the film. Before I made the film, look, I went to many, many, many Holocaust Museum officials and educators and Jewish organizations. And I'm sad to say they ignored me, or they gave me excuses. So I figured I'll do it myself. I'm at that stage of life, okay, and kids are grown, and I just feel extremely strong. So I've
I
devoted
think, yeah,
years.
I think you did a, a great thing in telling the story of the Holocaust by bullets in your documentary. And
Evelyn,
and
do you want to ask one more question before
yes,
we
yes.
wrap up?
So I think you gave a great example there of looking into your own story, your own family, and then telling that story. Now, what lessons can we learn from the history of the Holocaust by bullets? Are there specific lessons that are relevant in the light of today's anti-Semitism?
Well, I think Holocaust denial. Okay, we all know it's out there, and we fight it all the time. It doesn't help us fight Holocaust denial, in my opinion, if there are millions of Jewish shooting victims in Eastern Europe who are in mass graves that are unprotected, plundered, and unmarked. I mean, we have to do it as Jewish people. I think we'll be respected if we do. I think it gives Holocaust deniers an opening to say, well, what do you mean 2 million Jews or 2.5 million Jews were shot? Where is it? Well, what are we going to say? Well, they're over there. Of course, we haven't, their names are missing from the Yad Vashem database. By the way, about half of the shooting victims in Ukraine are missing from the Yad Vashem database. I mean, which means these names are lost forever. I myself, after I went to Ukraine with my daughter in 2015, I came back. A wonderful uncle, had made a family tree listing all the victims of the Holocaust. And I went to the Yad Vashem database, and out of 29, okay, this is siblings, nieces, nephews, and my there were only 11 names. So I entered myself. You can do this online. Enter names into the Yad Vashem victims database. One sad afternoon, Sunday afternoon, I entered 18 names, okay, including my great-grandmother. Right? She wasn't in there. These names are missing.
And also, and also in we can learn from the the level that atrocities can get to.
Well, that's true. It's such humanity. It's hard to comprehend, and I try not to dwell on it so much. Father Dubois, who's found all these, I think he's found over 3,000 or investigated over 3,000 execution sites, says the Holocaust by bullets taught him that anyone can be a victim, anyone can be a perpetrator. and that local people, because these were not done in secret. These were done in the open. They were public events, and there were many local witnesses. And Father Dubois says, people will watch mass shootings, mass killings if they know they're not going to be one of the victims. And what he did is, when in recent years, these witnesses are very old now, he tries to find them and talk to them, find out where the mass graves are, find out stories about local people. But my interest too is, look, not everyone. First of all, the reason I do this is because I feel so strongly about my grandmother, of course, my mother, and my father. And so this is what motivates me. Not everyone is so motivated, but part of it is I've studied, my family so much, and I think that's where this begins, which is people got to look at, especially Jewish people of Eastern European origin. They have to start looking into their background. I understand why, we're cut off. We don't want to think about it. It's so unpleasant. But we have a duty. We owe an obligation to these people who have been, these millions who have been shot and neglected for so long. And I think people will find this very rewarding. I mean, it's difficult, but rewards are intangible. But this is our obligation. The Holocaust, it's not like it ended and we don't have to do anything, or we just have to say we remember and we're sorry. We actively have to do things now. If people want to help, they can send the film to educators, universities, Holocaust museums, Jewish organizations, to get the word around. We must start talking about it.
John, our time is up, but I'm going to repeat then I think that's your closing message. Not only must we talk about it, but I am going to email my cousin afterwards. Our relatives come from Latvia. It is on Father Dubois' database about the mass killings there. My cousin has gone there and done research, but I don't know whether he's entered the names in Yad Vashem. So that's a starting point that all of us with Eastern European relatives can do. And I never thought about all the research my cousin Bruce Dumas has done, but have we entered the names in the database?
Yeah, it's very, very important.
So we're going to end with that charge that start small and expand to show this film. We're going to share the link with the description. We thank you so much for this. We thank our listeners. For those of you who want to know more about Evelyn and myself and our shows, you can go to our YouTube channel, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts to read the about. And
the Never Again Is Now podcast channel.
The Never Again Is Now podcast. And the word podcast is important when you're doing a search on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. And as we end every show, we say, please speak up without putting yourself in physical harm. Speak up against anti-Semitism and all hate.